What's up everyone, my name is Kelsey. Welcome back to my channel. So y'all noticed today that we're in a different place than usual, and it's because I'm lazy. We are, like two and a half weeks into self-isolating, and I just don't want to do anything, especially cleaning. So my bedroom is a mess, and you know, it's like really hard, much harder to keep my house clean when I'm in it all the time. So here we are, behind my desk. It's also a mess, but you know, it is what it is. So today we are doing a tag video, and Maddie over at The Book Pusher posted this video last week, and it was a lot of fun, so I figured I would give it a shot. It is called the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader book tag. I'll link Maddie's video down below because I know she adapted it from someone else's adapting, so you can like find all the original source material from her video. But I guess we will just get into the questions. So question one is, what is your fantasy origin story? That is how you came to read your first fantasy novel. And this question isn't super easy to answer because I've been reading adult novels since I was a kid, like kindergarten age. Not kindergarten. No, yeah, it was probably third grade I really got into adult novels. And I started with paranormal and horror thriller type deals. So like the Stephen King and Dean Koontz were two of my favorites, and I don't know where those fall on the fantasy genre line. There is a lot of paranormal stuff in both of those authors' books, so I feel like it counts. And then I also later got into like the paranormal romantic thrillers, so like the Karen Robards and Nora Roberts, more on like the magical side of fantasy. And then we get to my preteen years, which is where I went like really hard on the paranormal romance, okay? And there was one author, what was her name? Christine Feehan. And that's like really embarrassing to tell you all, I'm so sorry. But I'm gonna put some of the covers up here because I'm sure they're hilarious. Like I remember being embarrassed to have them in public. That's how embarrassing they were, but they were like straight up vampire romance novels, and I ate that shit up. But I guess I would say like the kind of fantasy I read now, I didn't really get into it until my mid-20s, and I think it was Victoria Schwab, the Shades of Magic series. That was the first one that sort of got me into it, and then I just never stopped. Question two is, if you could be the hero or heroine in a fantasy novel, who would the author be, and what's one trope you'd insist be in the story? I forgot to think about this in advance. I forgot to answer this one, so Okay, so for this one, I'm gonna go with, I'm gonna be so basic in this whole video. It's just gonna be Victoria Schwab over and over. But Victoria Schwab is gonna write it, and I want to be in like an urban sort of fantasy like her Villains duology. And I just wanna be Marcella. I just wanna be that character archetype. I just want to look badass and kill a bunch of people. Like, I mean, not in real life, just to be clear, I'm not gonna murder anyone, but in a fantasy novel, that's who I wanna be. Question three, what is a fantasy you've read this year that you want more people to read? By this year, I assume we're talking about 2020, and I'm gonna have to go with The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. This was just really good, and I haven't heard a ton of people talk about it. It's getting more hype now that the third book is about to come out, but I don't know, before I read it for this book club, it wasn't even on my radar. I never would have picked it up. I also watched it was like a review or a rave or something from, I think her name is Jess at Read Between the Wine, and I'm gonna link that video down below because once I saw what the book was for this book club, I looked up that, video reviews, and that was one that I was like, okay, maybe I should really read this book. And hopefully it will convince you too, because apparently I just can't do that right now. Question four, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre? What subgenre have you not read much from? This is hard to answer because I read a little bit of everything, but I tend towards high fantasy and portal fantasy. So portal fantasy is when like the original setting is like the real world, and then there's some sort of gateway into a magical fantasy world. So like Chronicles of Narnia with the wardrobe, and The City of Brass, which I just talked about, is like, it's set, I think, in the 1700s, and one of the characters goes through this gate and is suddenly in an alternate universe with magic. And then I also like straight up high fantasy, which are just invented worlds with magic, like Wicked Saints, Girls of Paper and Fire. Even though I feel like Girls of Paper and Fire could almost be low fantasy because it's a made-up world, but there's not really a lot of magic. In the second book, there's more, so I guess that could go either way. And then The Perfect Assassin by K.A. Dorr. That's a good one too. That's high fantasy, invented world with magic. I pretty much hate military fantasy. I've tried to read a couple and I just think like the big sweeping movements of nations and like the politics, I don't care about it. And I don't care about epic fantasy. There's just, epic fantasy tends to be high fantasy, but plus a lot more characters and a much bigger plot. And it's too much for me. Just not interested. And like recently I haven't read a lot of urban fantasy. I used to read a lot when I was like in middle school, but recently I haven't, and I really like it and I want to find more of it. Question 5, who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? This is weird because when I was thinking about it, I don't really auto-buy anyone. Victoria Schwab is my favorite author, and even she isn't auto-buy. Like, I don't read a lot of middle grade, so I didn't buy those books. I do automatically buy all of her adult fantasy though. Like, I'm definitely gonna pre-order The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Question 6, how do you typically find fantasy recommendations? Honestly, mostly Twitter. I watch a lot of BookTube, but I don't get a lot of fantasy recs from there because people tend to read stuff that's already well publicized. But on Twitter, I have really good luck following bloggers and authors who do recommendation threads, and that is the best way to find a whole bunch of books because you can find really specific threads. Like if I want to read a female fantasy where the girls have swords, like I could probably find a thread of those books. Question 7, what is an upcoming fantasy release you're excited for? I already talked about The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. That's Victoria Schwab, and it releases later this year. She's been talking about it for years, so I'm really, really hyped for it. Let's see, there's also The Unconquered City by K.A. Dorr, and this is technically the third in the series, and I haven't read the second one yet because I want to wait till the third book is closer. So I don't even really know what it's about. I just know it's set in this world, and it follows a different character than the first 2 books. And then I also have Beyond the Ruby Veil by Mara Fitzgerald, and this is, I think it's a young adult fantasy, high fantasy set in this world where there's one person that can make water from blood, and whenever anyone in this city shows a marking, some kind of marking, they have to be sacrificed in order to make water. But there's this, I think she's a princess and she's engaged to be married for the power. She's super ambitious, and that's one of the reasons I'm excited for it. So she has an arranged marriage with her BFF. She doesn't care that it's not a love match. They're both gay, and she gets this mark. So when the water maker comes for her, she fights back and kills the water maker, and it's the only one. So she has to flee from, the terrible mistake she's made. That sounds pretty good to me. Question 8, what is one misconception about fantasy you would like to lay to rest? I guess the biggest one is that it's hard to understand or that it's confusing. And I get that for big stories like epic fantasies, but for the most part, a good book will have readable, understandable world building. You just have to know where to start. And then once you get into fantasy, you start to learn like the conventions of world building and everything gets a little easier to understand. There's definitely patterns in how the worlds are built, and each book only has like variations on that. All right, related. Question 9, if someone had never read a fantasy before and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that come to mind as places to start, what would those recommendations be? So I would say it's easiest to get into urban fantasy and portal fantasy because they both have a basis in like our world, so you have somewhere to start. And then fabulism because it takes place in our world. Also in a portal fantasy, typically one of the main characters is from this world, so when they're introduced into the new fantasy world, you get to learn about it while they're learning about it, so it seems to come a little more naturally. All right, and I could not be more predictable, but A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. Since it's the book that got me into fantasy, I think it would be good, and it's a portal fantasy. There's 4 Londons. So one of the main characters is from our London, Grey London, and travels to this other London, and her perspective makes the world building a little easier to take. I also think V.E. Schwab just does a really good job with the world building, and it's just a great story. Okay, second I have Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. This is more fabulism, so it's set in our world with magical elements, and it follows these teenage girls on an island where teenage girls have been going missing for the last however many hundreds of years. And all of these 3 girls get sort of tangled up in this mystery and are trying to find a way to stop it. It's one of my favorites. It's one of my favorite young adult fantasies. There's a lot of female friendship. It's also queer. Two of the characters are into girls. I don't think it's specified how. And then one of the characters is asexual and hetero-romantic. What am I saying? All of these books are queer. Shades of Magic has a male-male relationship as well. And then my last recommendation is The Last Sun by Katie Edwards. This is more of an urban fantasy. I have a whole video about this one, so I'm just going to leave it up above if you're interested. This video is me trying to convince you to read it, and you really, really should. But because it's an urban fantasy and it's sort of set in our real world and it's set in modern day, so all of the characters have like modern speech patterns, which is another common problem I feel like people have with fantasy, is like a lot of them are historically inspired and they have that sort of like old English speech pattern. I really hate that and I tend to not read books that do that. All right, question 10. Who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you came across that you'd like to shout out? I have 3. They're not really that recent because I haven't been super active on BookTube lately. But Onyx Pages, she focuses on books about African descended people, but she reads a lot of Afrofuturism and sci-fi, but I've gotten really good fantasy recommendations from her too. She recently did a video review of The Good Luck Girls by Charlotte Nicole Davis, and that is officially on my wish list because of it. I have, Kay the Bookworm. She posts videos pretty sporadically, but totally worth a subscribe because she reads books that aren't super mainstream. So you can find a lot of things that you might not have otherwise heard of. And then Kayla from Crack Into a Good Book. She reads a lot, like a lot. So I think she does 2 wrap-ups every month, a mid-month and an end-of-month wrap-up, just because there's so many books to cover. And I like that she does that because it makes them manageable to consume. So if you're ever like, I have no idea what to read, that's a good channel to go to because I can guarantee she's got some books in there you haven't heard of. All right, that's it for the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. Let me know in the comments who some of your auto-buy fantasy authors are, because I'm always looking for more authors to try. If you like this video, hit like. If you want to see more, subscribe. I post book-related videos every Wednesday. If you want to keep talking, you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Kelsey Reads or Goodreads at Kelsey Lynn Reads. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.